So welcome back. In this video we will dive deeper into finalizing our designs and literally creating design system in the same time. Okay, so what we are going to do now, after we finished up our wireframes and connected them via prototype options, what we are going to do is create another page and call it design system. Okay, and what we are going to do there is we are going to create few of the components that we are going to reuse during our project, and within this wireframes page we are going to create our final designs, and later we are going to copy them into final design page or just design page, because we don't want to shuffle between pages while doing the design work. It doesn't really matter. The most important thing when working with the clients is project presentation and delivery. It's not about the process, it's about finished product. Okay, so basically what we are going to do is do a few stuff and create few components. There are going to be probably the button and input bars, maybe the logo type. We are going to create also the navigation bar on the bottom, and probably some of small things, but I think the button, input, navigation bar, logo are kind of must to have while designing the mobile application. So what we are going to start with is going to be the logo type. So what we are going to do is use this text and maybe do something else with it. But first let's create another page. So let's duplicate this screen right here. Okay, and let's remove all of those items except home indicator and status bar, because we are going to leave that. We have our text ready and we have our color styles ready, so basically we are set to start the project. Okay, so for the login what we need is our logo. So basically I'm going to duplicate stuff and arrange them properly while designing the final design, and I'm going to unlink this text and use some other font and see if I can maybe find something similar to the Instagram font that they're using. Okay, I haven't found some similar font that they're using, and probably you can find it on the internet for yourself, but I'm going to use the font Mole for this one. I think it looks nice. I think we can combine that kind of handwritten logo type with our proper clean designs. So basically we are going to stick with this one, and let's regulate the height. For example, it's 40 right here with a width of 190, and let's see the 34 by 40 width. I think that's fine for this big representations, and later we are going to scale it down maybe to 28 when we start designing the application. But as you're seeing, our logo type is literally going to be placed in 4 screens at all. So yeah, let's not waste too much of a time, but let's stick to the filling, maybe to the black, and place it, for example, somewhere in the middle. Okay, and let's create a component with that button, and we are going to call it logo 1, for example, or just logo. Okay, and I'm going to cut it from this screen and go to design system. Let's create some big frame that we are going to use, maybe something white, that we are going to see our elements properly, and just duplicate it and move it, for example, there. It doesn't really need to be too much of organization in this screen, but for these small application and small projects, you can just place them around and try to maybe create something for yourself that can work for you. Every single designer have different processes and different variants of what works for him, what doesn't. So basically try to find something that works for you. Okay, and now what we have when we go to the assets and go to the frame, we are going to see the logo that we can use basically, and I can just place it right here, and let's set maybe the distance is 68 from the top. Okay, the next thing what we need to design is basically the input bars and the CTA, or literally button. So yeah, let's do it. So basically we are going to use the auto layout option for that, and we are going to create the 48 height for input bars and buttons. Usually try to stick with one height for those two elements, so the input bars and buttons are exactly the same with the height and most of the time as well as width of the element. Okay, so yeah, let's start by creating the text, and let's type login. Not with that one for sure, and let's try to stick with, for example, body. It's fine, it's 14 by 16, as we are going to, when we unlink it, we can see the font weight, font size is 14 and font or line height is 16. Okay, but let's see what we use here. It's a body. Let's stick with body. I think that's a normal size when we are going to use on the mobile. On the desktop you can use 16, for example, for the buttons, but it doesn't really matter. We are going to add our auto layout option with Shift A or right click and add auto layout option. And let's now change few stuff around here. So as we are seeing, the height is 36, so if we try to make it as 48, we have the height vertical padding on the bottom is 10 and the top is 10 plus the line height of the text that we are using. So let's see, for example, if we say it 14, it's going to be 44, but if we say 16, it's going to be 48. And for the height, we are not going to, for example, change this one to something else. We can just go here and click fix width and say 361. I think that's the height between the margins. Okay, yes it is. Okay, and basically let's change the fill to the primary color, and let's change that color to the white, so we are seeing this kind of CTA button. Okay, and let's change the radius to, for example, let's see how 8 looks when we go Shift G. 8 looks nice. Let's see how 12 looks. For example, I think 12 is too rounded for me, so I will stick by 8 for the buttons. Okay, so basically what we are going to do now is cut this with Command or Control X and paste it in the design systems. Let's rename this to the design system. Okay, and change this button to the component by clicking that button, and let's call it just a normal button. Okay, so now we have our button that we can reuse during the project. So let's go back to the screen and go to the assets and place that button right there. Okay, next thing what we need to do is to have the register on the bottom. What we are going to do maybe for that is to recreate or add another variant to this button, but without any fill. So let's get back to the layers and design system. And what we are going to see now is that we have this add variant button, and when we click on that, we are going to see another variant popping up here. And what we are going to do is remove the filling for that, and let's remove it. Let's change that text to the black. Okay, so basically what we have is a button variant default and variant 2, for example, or let's call it no fill. Okay, so default and no fill. And basically what it's going to do, when we now go to our copied components, we are going to see the options to change our variants. Okay, so basically what we are going to do is move this slightly up, and let's see, we have a register on the bottom, so let's change this. Oops, let's change this one to the no fill and change this to the register, but let's say we are going to have align center, and call it register. Okay, basically now we have two buttons that are below one each other, and we are going to use the auto layout option for these two. So let's select them, Shift A, and let's say the distance between those two elements could be, let's say 12 at first. Yeah, I think that's about right. Here is 58 distance. So yeah, it all depends on what are your preferences between the distance on the bottom and the buttons. But what we can see, for example, is that 58 divided by 4 is 14 by 14.5. So what we can do is maybe stick to, let's say 50 or maybe even 60 from the bottom. Okay, so maybe 60 is right option to have distance between the elements, but even we can go lower, for example 48. Maybe that can also be right. Yeah, let's just stick with 48. I think that's fine totally for any usage. And what we also need is input bars. So basically we are going to do the same process, but now we are not going to have the item in the center, we are going to have it on the left side. Okay, so what we are going to do is maybe just duplicate this text and change, for example, to the username. Now, of course, we are not going to see it properly, so let's change it to the black. And let's use exact same method, Shift A. And let's change the vertical padding to 16. And what we are going to do is use exactly the same fixed width, 361, and change the align to the left with the 10 pixels, horizontal gap, horizontal padding 10. Now it's kind of different thing to change the horizontal padding, because also we have our margins on the side. It's 16, and we are going to have the margins or that padding inside the elements as well. So for example, what we can do is change that to 16 to see how it's going to look like. So this is 16. When we fill out that bar, for example, with a gray one, for example, and change the corner radius to the 8, we are now seeing that we have our distance 16, and inside that is 16. Now it all depends on the projects that you are working on. For example, in this case we used 16 on all of our objects, and that's totally fine. And inside those elements we are now seeing, for example, 22 on some elements. On this one they're just placed as they are. For example, with the input bars we are seeing the 12, for example. So let's see how it's going to look with the 12, but I think we should stick with 16. Yeah, I think it looks cleaner when we use the 16, so we are going to stick with that. Okay, so we have our first input bar. Let's cut that and change it or paste it into our design system. Use the component icon and change that to the input. Okay, input. And now we have our input right here. Later what we are going to do, for example, is let's add another variant. And what we are going to do now is place maybe the icon inside that one, for example, for the search. So basically, let's go to the plugins, feather icon, and let's search for the search. Let's search for the search icon. So basically what we are going to do now is when we have our search, we can place it inside. Okay, and now it looks kind of strange as we are seeing, but let's not freak out because of that. Okay, we have the distance between our elements. For example, they can be 8 in this case, or even the 12 can work sometimes. But yeah, we can stick with 8 distance. And what we are going to do in this case, for example, we have our line height 16 here, and we have our icon that's 24 by 24. What we can do is just maybe scale it down to maybe 20, but still we have our height not so well. So basically what we can do is go to the fixed height and change it to 48, and now we have the same height in this one and in this one, and we have the distance between the elements 8. And when we click on this, we are seeing that we have our selection color to something else. So we can select, for example, black. Let's change this one to the search. And let's change maybe the opacity to the elements to something else. For example, gray 4, I think. Yeah, that's totally fine. And we can change that variant to the search. Okay. So basically now we have the username and we have our other input bar, for example, to search something during interface. Okay. So let's go back to our screens. And let's go to the assets or local components and place our inputs right here. For example, we have our username and we have our password. And let's auto layout them as well and change the distance between those elements, maybe 12, as we have it down there. And let's also shift A those elements and change the distance, for example, to 48. Yeah, 48 can work. Now we have something that's moved, so let's just place it down. And now we have our login screen done. So we have our username, password, login, register, and basically the next screen is going to be exactly the same thing. So let's duplicate it. The distance between those doesn't really matter. Here is 65, but we can just duplicate it. For example, 88 can work as well. It doesn't really matter. And in this case, what we can do is just duplicate those inputs. Let's just move it to something else. For example, 48. Okay. And what we can do is basically just change the text in these components. So let's change this one to the register and let's change this one to the back. So basically it sticks with the same variant, but we can change the text inside. So we don't need to copy the things, move them around, place them around. When you have proper instruction to design system, everything is much easier. And we now can just place, for example, first name, last name, username, password right here. Okay. And after that's done, what we can do is now change and duplicate this screen. For example, we can remove or ungroup first all of those elements, even those, remove this and remove that one. And for example, we can move it below, maybe to 48, for example. And let's duplicate this text in the middle and let's change it to the black. Okay, thank you for registration. Continue by using our app. What we can also do is maybe remove this text or just cut it from there and create something else. For example, we can change it to the subheading and change it to something else, maybe like this. Let's shift A and let's set the distance maybe by 8 and let's align them in the center of the application. So basically now we have something different than just a basic screen that we are seeing there. So now we have our login, register that we can use and register to. So basically we have all of those screens ready. And the other thing is that we are now going to focus on our other screens. Okay.